We might get started because we've got a bit to go through today. Thank you to everybody that has joined us this evening. Tonight, we're going to be talking about understanding sexual harassment and, the obligations as employers around that space. Just a little bit of housekeeping to start off with. If you have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A and we will answer them all at the end. And you can do that as you go along. And I'm more than happy to stay on and chat through any particular issues for anyone that needs it. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that we're all meeting on today and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I would also like to extend that to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples that are joining us today. So this is me. My name is Carly Saw. I started in HR in 1996, but I founded Strawberry Seed in 2013. I am the director and founder, and I that's a little bit about me. Now I'd like to introduce you to our team. This is my wonderful team, Strawberry Seed Consulting. We provide HR consulting and recruitment services right across Australia to all different types of businesses. And these are the lovely people that help me do it. So I want to start off with talking about why this actually matters. Like, why does it matter that we understand what our obligations are in this area? So a few stats to start off. 1 in 3 Australian workers have experienced workplace sexual harassment in some form or another. 41% are women, and they're likely to experience more than men, who it's around 26%. In terms of reporting, the research shows that only 18% of victims actually make a formal report or complaint. And, of those, 1 in 5 felt no action was actually taken. And a lot of people just are scared of the process. So, or the consequences. So they don't actually make a complaint. And of those who did report, 19% reported that they were ostracised by colleagues, 18% ended up resigning, and 17% reported that absolutely no action was taken on their behalf. In terms of perpetrators, it's fairly balanced actually between incidents that are involving other people in the workplace. At nearly 45%, and it's just over 40% for external parties. So that might be clients or customers or patients. And whilst the majority, 99% of medium to large businesses actually have policies in place, only 27% don't monitor what their risks are or don't actually check into them. And there's some very specific vulnerable demographics that we have within our workplaces. So younger workers are particularly vulnerable when it comes to harassment. So are those of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander backgrounds, and as are those of LGBTIQA workers as well. So let's get into the laws. I think it's, a good place to start. We're not going to spend a huge amount of time there, but I think it's important to understand that there are a number of laws that actually cover this within Australia. So the main legislation that we generally look to is the Sex Discrimination Act, which came into play in 1984, which may seem like a long time ago, but given that that was, the first legislation that put protections in place in regards to sexual discrimination, it actually wasn't really that long ago. So that act is really about making sure it actually brought into law that sexual harassment is unlawful, and it certainly very clearly defines employer duties. And most recently in the last few years, it's included positive duties. So there is a positive duty that you have to try to prevent. It's not just a duty to actually deal with an issue when it arises, but you have a positive duty to actually take as many precautions and protections as you can to try and prevent it from happening in the first place. Now, the Fair Work Act also provides protections and around sexual harassment, definitely around dispute resolution. They can issue stop sexual harassment orders. And so they also have an expectation of that positive duty. We also have workplace and health, the Health and Safety Acts for all the states and territories, as well as discrimination acts. Now, from a work health and safety point of view, certainly psychosocial risks have recently been something a lot of people are talking about. So, you know, if you have harassment in your workplace, then you will not be meeting your obligations there. You have an obligation to provide a safe workplace for people, and if people are being harassed, that's not a safe workplace. So it is also, you know, it's always important to look at both the local laws and the federal laws, though they are fairly in line these days. It does depend on what state you're in. You know, normally Victoria's usually and New South Wales often are the ones that are kind of at the forefront of moving things forward, being some of the largest states, but they are all fairly in line. And the last one is the Human Rights Commission Act. So they also now, the Australian Human Rights Commission also actually has enforcement powers now around, and they can actually just proactively come out and visit workplaces. So that's something that only came in quite recently at the end of 2023. So what actually is sexual harassment? It's any unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature that makes someone feel offended, humiliated, or intimidated that any reasonable person would expect would cause that reaction. And it's really important to understand that it doesn't matter how the person intended those actions, it's how it made that person feel. So it's how it was received by that person. And the reasonable person test is something we hear a lot in law. And so it's really looking at what your average person, having all of the circumstances, all the information and facts in front of them of what happened, how it happened, who was involved, you know, everything about those people, would believe it was inappropriate behaviour for the workplace. And so, you know, often you can have that mythical, reasonable person in your head and go, well, you know, given all the information that I have, it's actually a really good test, something to sort of look at as an employer. I have all this information in front of me, like, you know, stepping back and trying to look at this from the outside. If I showed all this to someone externally, and asked them whether they thought this had happened, or this was offensive, or this would make someone offended or make them feel uncomfortable, would they think that? And often it's actually you know, good to get a second opinion on that. And we'll talk about confidentiality, but, you know, whether it's ringing someone like us or, you know, reaching out to, you know, other supports that are out there for businesses, but really ensuring that because your life experience and the way you see the world may not see that what someone's brought to you as a complaint is something that, you know, why are they offended by that? I wouldn't be, but just because you weren't doesn't mean that person isn't. So I'm going to go through some of the most common forms of sexual harassment. And look, I think most people are really across what all of the, I guess, the most well-known ones are. And, you know, I often get, I recently went up to Sydney to do some training with one of our clients around workplace culture and conduct. And, you know, a lot of people said, oh, well, those things don't happen in the workplace anymore. And I'm like, I'm sorry to tell you, my 30 years of HR says different to that. We're literally we were involved earlier this year in a termination of somebody for sexual harassment in the workplace. So the sort of things that might, you know, be included. So if someone making really suggestive comments or jokes, you know, so it might be just a lot of innuendo, you know, crude humour, making remarks or comments about a person's appearance or their sex life. And we'll talk about that. It was only a joke as we go along. Intrusive questions about a person's private life or physical appearance, you know. You know, it really comes back to consent, and it's one of those things that I think a lot of people forget. You know, if someone says something, you know, asks you a question about your private life and they say, I don't really want to talk about that, and you just let that go, that's not going to be seen as harassment. But if you continue to needle them or see that, you know, you have someone who sees that as an opportunity, as a weak spot, and just continues to ask you because they know it makes you feel uncomfortable, particularly when it's of a sexual nature, that will definitely be under harassment. Inappropriate steering or leering, you know, anybody that has ever felt somebody just staring at them, it just sends a shiver up your spine. I think most of us are aware that unwelcome touching, hugging, cornering, kissing, even things like deliberately brushing past somebody in a, confined area so that you have to, your bodies have to touch, or, sort of putting your hands on someone as you walk past them. Again, it's not how it's intended, it's how it's taken. And look, you might have a workplace where everybody knows each other really well. I've worked in workplaces where everyone gets along really well. They hug each other because they're friends outside of work. They've built these relationships over time. But you don't do that with someone you don't know. You wouldn't walk up to a stranger and just, touch them inappropriately or brush past them when you don't have to. And, I think everybody, has probably been in situations, whether it's in a noisy nightclub when you're younger, or you might still go when you're older. That sounds terrible to me now, but when people just deliberately put their hands on your hips or something as you go past, and you're not consenting to someone touching you, and everyone has the right to have control on that. Sort of sexual gestures, indecent exposure, sexually explicit emails or images. So, I started in the workforce 30 years ago, and there were still pin-ups in change rooms. They existed, and then we moved on to screensavers, inappropriate screensavers, and people sending inappropriate emails or images to each other at work. And again, I would like to think people know that that's not okay, but it certainly doesn't seem that way. Repeated inappropriate invitations to go out on dates. So I met my husband at work. People spend a lot of time at work. They do meet partners and things, but there's a big difference between asking someone out once and they nicely say, I'm not really interested, and just continually pestering them. It steps over a line from being a question to harassment. And certainly, I think we all understand sexual assault or attempting sexual assault. It's illegal. It's beyond harassment. It's actually illegal, and it's much less common. It doesn't happen very often. It doesn't happen any more often in a workplace than it would happen anywhere else in life. But it's a criminal offence. So usually, when there's sexual assault involved, there's often police involved as well. Any behaviour that targets someone based on their sex. So it doesn't necessarily have to be sexual in nature, but it can just be things like being hostile towards someone, insulting them, belittling behaviour. There's an issue we've got going on with a client at the moment, and there seems to be a little bit of a misogyny aspect to it, that a particular employee doesn't like the fact that a younger female is now seen as their manager, and is very much pushing back against that. And that's going to come under sexual harassment if they continue with that behaviour. Certainly sharing explicit content or conversations in group chats or forums, just because it's outside of work. So if you're making comments, in a forum and that's not part of the workplace, in outside work hours, but you're making it about another employee, then guess what? That still counts. I have had several cases where people go, oh, but we were messaging each other on Facebook over the weekend. Well, you're certainly fooling yourself if you think that just because it didn't happen on a work device or at work, it involves someone when you work with, it's going to have an impact on the work environment and that relationship at work, particularly if that, when that's found out. Because if it's happening and you don't know it's happening, that's one thing, but that's not great. But when someone finds out, it becomes a workplace issue. And so I think very early on, when social media started, there was a thought that, oh, well, that has got nothing to do with the workplace. But I think that's very naive, particularly now in 2025, when it's so much more common for people to work remotely, and digital communication is such a large part of what we do. So, thinking that, harassment through digital channels, constant messages, it may not be in person, but it might be sending inappropriate things. It might be messaging someone constantly. There's so many ways we communicate now. And so it's really important for everyone to understand that, there is no border with that if it's against another employee. So how do we manage complaints when we get them? I want to do a little bit of myth busting first, because I still do hear some things that are said, and we'll cover some frequently asked questions a little later as well. But we need a formal complaint before we act. We had a case like this earlier this year where there'd been someone who was a known entity within the workplace who had a history and pattern of behaviour, but nobody wanted to make a formal complaint. And it had been quite some time since our last formal complaint was made. And unfortunately, this person just, unfortunately, the owner of the business thought that they had to wait until there was a formal complaint. But you have a duty of care, legally to provide a safe working environment. So even if you are aware that's going on, maybe you're hearing it from employees that are leaving, or people are telling you that they don't want to make a formal complaint, you can't just ignore it and say, well, I don't have a formal complaint in writing, I can't deal with it. It's someone's word against another and we can't do anything. You have to investigate. And investigations are based on the balance of probabilities. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. But, there's a lot of things that you can look at to decide whether or not there's enough information to substantiate. And often it's a pattern of behaviour. And a quick apology will just fix it. It might, if it's a really minor, incident, if someone has, without thinking, sort of pushed past someone and brushed their body against them to get to the photocopier once off, and that person makes a complaint and it hasn't happened before and they've never made them feel uncomfortable previously and they just didn't think about what they were doing, and then they do apologize and go, look, I'm so sorry, that wasn't something that I didn't even think about it, I just did it, and next time I'll really be aware that I don't want to make you feel uncomfortable. Sometimes that will be enough for everyone to move forward, but the nature of the response really must match the impact of the behaviour at hand. So what's best practice for dealing with a complaint? So first of all, take every complaint seriously. You need to treat them all as legitimate and worthy of attention. And your initial response is going to make a big difference to how this person feels. So, you have to be calm and empathetic and non-judgmental. You're not there to take sides, but someone is actually bringing that to you. As I said, 17% of people, only 17% actually bring them forward. So it takes a lot of courage for someone to bring things forward. So you need to make sure that you respond in a way that's has a lot of empathy. Obviously, you need to ensure immediate safety and support of anybody. So are there any immediate risks? This is going to depend on the nature of what's happened. But if it's a case of, particularly when there might be a power imbalance, for example, when it's, a young employee and an older, more senior employee, there may be some, adjustments that need to be made, and, really making sure that you are removing them from that situation so they're not put under any further stress until, you can start to look into it. And there's certainly a lot of support services out there, an employee assistance program. We've just started with a new employee assistance program, an online one called Talked, and where it's fantastic. And, so really having something like an EAP to provide to an employee in that situation, because you don't have to be the expert on how to support them, right? You're their manager, or you're the person or the HR person, or the person they've come to. You don't have to be a professional to, actually know exactly what to say and do, but in terms of their psychological support. So having an EAP is a really handy thing to have. And if you don't have one, go and source something that could be of help. You definitely want to maintain confidentiality and procedural fairness. So we'll talk about procedural fairness when we get to the discipline process, but the more people that know about something, the bigger the issue gets. So it's as required basis. Maintaining confidentiality in any complaint around harassment, whether it's sexual harassment or another type, is really important, because the more people that are involved, the bigger the issue gets and the harder it is to move past it. So you want to make sure you're being fair to both parties, both the person who is making the allegation and the person who that allegation is against. You shouldn't be prejudging any outcome until you've gone through a process of looking at what's happened. Only involve people in the process that need to be involved. You don't need to be telling the entire leadership team. You don't need to be telling the entire department. And you also need to be making sure that those that are involved whether the complaint's made against them or they're making the complaint, you need to remind them at every step of the way that it's really important that they also maintain confidentiality. And if they need to talk about it, they can come and talk to you about it within the organisation, that because otherwise it can really get out of control quite quickly. And then you're going to start to decide on what the appropriate response path is. So this is going to come down to the nature and seriousness of the complaint. And, if you just come back to the idea that the more serious the complaint, the more serious the response needs to be. So it might be just an informal resolution. It might be a facilitated conversation. It might not even be a facilitated conversation. It may be that somebody just makes an apology. There could be mediation if it's appropriate, but in some instances, the person who makes the complaint just often wants it to stop or wants to move forward. They don't necessarily want to make it a big deal. I always ask that person who's made the complaint, what would you like to see happen next? And if they say, look, I don't want to make a big deal about it, I always ask if they want to apologise to you, how would you, are you open to that? And if they say no, then you've got to respect that. Now, if it's more serious or it's an ongoing allegation or there's a pattern of poor behaviour in this area, then you definitely should move to an informal investigation. If you've already had an informal resolution with someone and that same person has repeated this behaviour, they did not get that. They didn't get the memo. So we're going to now be moving them to a much more formal process. And again, this is going to depend on what the nature of what's happened. Because if it was something that was, if it's really blatant and there's some malice there and there's a whole heap of things you can take into consideration, the power imbalance, you might skip straight to formal. I had an issue with a client not that long ago where at the end of last year, after on the way home from a Christmas party, people sharing an Uber to a very inebriated gentleman who had broken up with his girlfriend and was had a lot to drink, was sharing an Uber with two workmates on the way home, and he put his head in the person's lap and then he sort of put his hand on her leg, and whether or not he remembered that the next day, it wasn't something, I don't think it was something that was done with malice, but it certainly made that person feel really incredibly uncomfortable and unsafe. And that person wanted to apologise. That person, the person who made the complaint said, look, I don't want to actually discuss it with them. And that turns out that employee was leaving shortly. So they just sort of made it so they didn't really have to interact in that time. But, you can look at alternative approaches. So there are some restorative processes you can consider. We're going to talk about trauma-informed responses in a moment. But look, if the person doesn't want to make a formal complaint, depending on the nature of what's happening, if it's a one-off, it's the first time a complaint has come up, they don't want to make a formal complaint and you don't believe it's a serious risk to the workplace, then, there may be some other things that you can consider doing. And sometimes it's saying, well, okay, maybe we do need to do some training for everybody, if you haven't done that already, just to sort of make sure everybody's on the same page. And so it's not necessarily targeted at that individual, though that incident may be what prompted it, but you do a training session with everybody, so so that everybody knows what is and isn't acceptable. But there are alternatives, and it's sometimes it's about talking to the people involved. So you do want to, if it is required to do an investigation, you want to conduct that in a fair and timely manner. So ideally using someone impartial or a trained investigator, someone external. We often get asked to come in and sort of have initial conversations, mainly because, particularly in small business, it can be really difficult to sort of step back from the issue. The people involved. You've got a very close relationship with them. It depends on the size of your organisation and the levels of management you have and a lot of different things. And but if you are going to handle it internally, you want to make sure that you have a very consistent process, and you want to set some clear timelines. So you want to make sure that you're not just letting it float out into the future. Let someone know I'm going to. So there are times where someone might go and work from home while this is happening, or they might be stood down depending on the nature of so you need to make sure that you're moving at a pace that is, moving it forward. But having said that, moving at a pace that's not trying to just rush it. If you need time to talk to several people, take that time to do that. If you have to wait for someone to come back from leave to, who you need to speak to, then let the complainant know that, hey, I'd want to be able to speak to this person. They're not back from leave till next week, so it will take me a few extra days to come back. So just give them updates on where they're at. It's interesting that, there's not one way to approach it. It's not a one size fits all. So you may start with a bit of you may choose to do an investigation, depending on what's happened. You may choose to go into an investigation, tell the person who the complaint's made against, that an investigation is happening and you're going to be interviewing witnesses. Have they got any witnesses they want you to interview? Sometimes, depending on what's happened, the first conversation may be to go to that person and say, listen, a complaint has been made. I want to put that, we're just at the information gathering stage at this point. I just wanted to sort of talk to you and see, if from your perspective, do you agree that this happened? Do you, and sometimes that person says, yeah, no, that actually happened. And then you don't necessarily have to go down the path of interviewing witnesses and other things. I mean, they may say, yes, that happened, but I didn't mean it. There was no intention, whatever it might be. But you might be able to stop short of actually involving a whole heap of other people. So it's always a risk assessment, but that's why there's not a one size fits all approach. Now, you need to take action, whatever that action is. So if you are satisfied on the balance of probabilities, which is the burden of proof we have here, that the complaint is substantiated, or maybe the person, several people witnessed it, or maybe that person said, yeah, no, I did do that. Then you need to think about what's the appropriate disciplinary or corrective action that needs to be taken, and we'll discuss that in a moment. Now, if it's not substantiated, if you can't find anything to substantiate it, it does get a little trickier, because you want to believe people, and we should be believing people. It's interesting. I was reading a statistic that, we're going to talk a little bit about false allegations too, but, false allegations is something that people are always really worried about, but it's so rare. And false allegations don't happen just as often with, sexual harassment or sexual allegation complaints as they do with any other type of crime. So, if it's something that you go, look, I'm not saying that it didn't happen, I just don't have enough information for me to know one way or the other whether it did or didn't. There's still things that you can do to go. But having said that, we're going to do some training with everybody to ensure that everybody's on the same page. In the future, here's some things we're going to put in place that might fix that problem. And regardless of the outcome, assess whether or not there's something that needs to be addressed or changed, because is it a one-off thing that's just a misunderstanding, which does happen, or is it something that's a bit more systemic about something else? And often that comes to light because you go to investigate something and everyone goes, yeah, but everybody talks to each other like that, or everybody says that. He says that to everybody and nobody's ever complained about it before. Or she does that all the time. She's always trying to get into people's personal lives. Then that's something you need to address, right? Just because the other people weren't offended by it doesn't mean it's not a potential risky behaviour that's happening in your organisation. So always make sure you communicate the outcomes to all parties and close that loop. What are the next steps? What are, has it been, how is it being resolved? If it's been resolved, making sure that you are very clear, again, at every step through the process to everybody involved, whether you're a witness, whether you made the complaint, etc., that privacy and confidentiality is really important. You also definitely want to monitor to make sure that there's no retaliation or anything ongoing. So usually there is, whether it's a formal warning or not, there's usually some sort of part of the process that's telling the person the allegation was made against, look, regardless of whether they're admitting it or not, you need to ensure that you don't take any retaliatory action against the employee who made the complaint. And if you do, then that's going to be the issue we're dealing with next. So it takes time. It takes time for people to move past it. I've seen many issues that, are varying levels of severity where people stuffed up, or they said the wrong thing, or they did the wrong thing. And at the end of the day, it's resolved, whether there's warnings or not. But the next step is, how do we move forward? And that's not easy, and it's not simple. And there might be some temporary changes within the workplace, or there might be a need, or it might be a need of, what are the things, times these people have no choice but to be together, versus, whether or not you can keep them completely separate. But if everybody, the more people that know, the more it sort of sits there. And I often refer to them a giant pink and purple polka dotted elephant in the corner of the room. And it's massive when it first happens. Everybody knows it's there, it's feeling it's there. But if everyone keeps looking at it, it's going to stay there. Whereas if over time we try and move away from it and just go, let's let it do its thing and let's try and move forward. If all parties move forward, it gets smaller and smaller till eventually it's something in the past. But if anyone keeps bringing it up, then that is something that might need to be addressed. And record and review, document. I can't say that word enough. Every step you take in a process, every conversation that you have, just make notes about it. Send an email to another person, or, you've got to document what you did and what actions you took, because if it is ever questioned, you need to be able to show that you went through a fair and reasonable process. And certainly we'll talk about policies and training in a moment. So what do you want to do? You want to act quickly and document all steps. So don't let it sit. Don't wait a week and a half to start the process. Get on it quickly. Protect the well-being and privacy of all parties. Assess what risks there are and take preventative action if you can. Train your managers on how to respond and support people lawfully. If you're in a larger organisation where there are different managers that someone might go to, those managers need to understand that they can't go, just don't worry about it. If someone makes a complaint, that's not okay. Offer support to both parties, because, again, regardless of the outcome, both parties are involved and both are employees of your organisation. And make sure that there's nothing systemic going on in regards to, behaviours that have become normal in your workplace. What you don't want to do is ignore informal reports or warnings. So if people are making informal reports, if they're kind of making backhanded comments, and you're hearing a whisper, or there's things that are kind of, tickling the back of your brain and making you go, there might be something going on there, don't dismiss it. Actually, look into it a bit further and make sure that little thing doesn't become a big thing. Don't dismiss a complaint just based on intent. They didn't mean it that way. Well, it doesn't matter how they meant it. Don't require the complainant to actually confront the harasser unless they're happy and comfortable doing so. I've seen so many people go, oh, well, we'll just bring them together. I'm like, well, hang on. Let's take a step back and work out what's happened first. Do they actually want to be together? Is that going to improve the situation, or is it going to cause more issues? Don't delay action while you're waiting for a formal complaint. You can get things started while you're waiting for that formal complaint to come in, or it may not. So you may need to get started anyway. And don't assume that confidentiality means silence. It means limited disclosure with care. So it doesn't mean you don't talk to anybody about it, because you have to talk to some people about it, and particularly those involved about it. But you just need to be very mindful of who is brought in and, the reasons why. So for those that have heard of it, trauma-informed complaints handling is an approach that is really about putting the people in the middle of it. Because what you don't want to do is actually make a situation worse for someone in how you've handled the situation. So if somebody has, had an incident with someone where there's some sexual harassment, particularly as it gets to a more severe end, they're already probably feeling unsafe or disempowered. And what we don't want to do is actually re-traumatize them through the process that we follow when investigating. So you don't, you may have heard the term do no harm, first do no harm. So we want the process we go through within a workplace. Now, it's not always you can't say, well, it's going to be easy. It won't be, but what we want to do is not make it worse. So we're trying to minimise any further harm to someone while still conducting a fair and robust process to ensure that, we're taking into consideration both parties. So it's not about compromising that fairness and evidence or due process. But if you're transparent and you communicate and you're supportive and you're careful about what you say and how you say it through the process, and that actually can help the process rather than harm it. So there's a couple of key principles with this. The first is always safety. So that's both physical and psychological safety. So we want to make sure that complainants always feel physically safe and emotionally protected. So that might include who you give them the option to speak to, who they feel most comfortable speaking to, where you have meetings, whether it's on-site or off-site, how communication happens, are you just going to communicate with them in writing at this point? They don't feel comfortable being in the room. You need to be very clear and transparent throughout the process as well, so that they know what to expect. So let them know how the process is going to work, what you're going to be doing next. Check in with them and let them know where you're up to. Let them know when you are involving somebody else in the process, and tell them the timeframes. Now, it might come a time that time frame has to change, or something, that person's not in today, or there's, it's just and just agree how you're going to do some regular follow-ups and communication. So you might say to them, look, I might check in with you. I'll check in with you on Thursday afternoon, regardless of what happens, or whether we've managed to get everything that we need. And I'll just let you know where we're up to, even if that answer is, look, we haven't got any further yet for this reason. So it's giving someone that consistency. And it's giving them that, if they feel like they might be feeling very out of control, like they don't feel like they're controlling a lot of this process. Once you open up to someone, you're handing that control to somebody else. So the more that you can make them feel in control by knowing aspects to the process, that's going to be a lot more supportive for them. Give them choice where possible, that might be choice of whether they want to have someone there to support them, or whether or not they want to, access EAP. Allow them to set boundaries on what they're comfortable sharing and who they're comfortable sharing with, and what, and be very careful on how you put things, because you don't want to use any type of language that's going to try and coerce them into a certain way of thinking or doing or making decisions, or put pressure on them in any way. So you need to be very mindful of how you're communicating with them, and give them as much control as you can. So, it is going to get tricky, and I'm going to touch on when someone doesn't want to make a formal complaint. But, if they're saying, if it's a minor issue and they don't want to make it a formal complaint and take it any further, you want to respect their wishes as much as you can. And, certainly be driven by them. Don't force them to sit and listen to an apology if they don't want to. Don't force them to receive a written apology if they don't want to. And treat everybody who is involved as active participants. They're not a passive subject that this is happening to. They're part of the process. So all voices should be heard. All voices should be given the opportunity to get support. And what you don't want to do is make it overly legalistic or adversarial. It doesn't need to be that at the workplace level. Like, you're not, particularly if you're not an experienced or trained investigator, or what you want to do is just be a human being and support another human being. And whether or not you believe them or not, whether or not you have your own opinions on what might have happened or not happened, you need to go in with an open mind. You need to be supportive, and just take it one step at a time. And recognize the impact of trauma. Trauma can affect people in a lot of different ways. It can affect their memory, their behavior, their emotional responses. People can mistake someone being nervous or emotional or inconsistent as dishonesty, but it actually just might be how they're reacting to the situation. You have fight, flight, freeze, and fawn is another one. So there's different reactions different people can have. So just because they're not responding in a way that you think they should be responding doesn't mean that they're not being honest about the situation. Always allow plenty of time if they want breaks, if you are talking to them about an issue, and they're sort of having to share some details with you, let them know you can take a break at any time. Would you mind if I asked you a couple of questions to just clarify a couple of things? Like, ask their permission through the process, and certainly don't force someone to retell their story over and over again to you and someone else and someone else. So in terms of trauma-informed complaint handling, think there's a few things here that I've included a bit of detail here so that those that'll get a copy afterwards if they're interested in it. But allow for written reports or verbal reports or third party reports. Don't pressure someone to disclose everything at once. Be very careful of the language you use. Make sure it's very supportive and neutral and not blaming. Don't use terms like accuser or alleged victim. Offer as much support as they need, and as I said, if you don't have an EAP program, certainly consider reaching out and finding one, particularly if it's a more serious issue. Make sure that if you're going to meet with them, choose really neutral spaces, provide those breaks, allow flexibility in how they're conducted. If they say, I just want to do it over the phone, there's nothing wrong with that. Document everything yourself, but also ask them to review their statements if possible. So if they've given you a statement, you've taken some notes, ask them to read over it before it's finalised. And don't edit their voice. It's a tricky thing to do, to not edit, put your own thoughts or assumptions or into writing those notes. So it's a difficult thing to do. And look, I have to say AI is making it a lot easier for us these days, because a lot of times now we can have a video conference with someone and AI can take notes in the background, and actually you can have a full transcript in their words. So you're not actually putting words in their mouth. And regardless of what the outcome is, just make sure you're compassionate and clear, explain why, those decisions are made, and acknowledge that how much courage it took for them to come forward and how much you appreciate how much they trusted you to do that. In terms of disciplinary action, look, you're all going to hate me because it's going to be my normal HR. Well, it's all going to depend, but, the outcome is always got to be proportionate with what's happened. So you've got to look at things like, what was the severity and nature of what happened? Was it one-off? Is this repeated behaviour? How has it impacted that person concerned? What are the power dynamics? Is it a young employee with an older employee? Or is it two peers that are pretty much on the same level? And how has the person who's been accused have they responded? Are they remorseful? Are they insightful? Are they cooperating? Are they kind of acknowledging that they've done the wrong thing, if that's what's happened? Or are they just trying to blow it off and gaslight and do all those things? That all of those things should be taken into consideration. So, you've got to ask yourself some questions like, has their behaviour actually breached the policy or a law? Possibly both. Have this person received any warnings previously? Have they received training in this area? Like, if you've only recently done some training across your organisation and someone is doing something that is really against what you've just done the training on, they had no, that's one of the reasons you do training. That's part of the proactive part of it, is you want to make it really clear what is and isn't acceptable. So if someone does the wrong thing, you're able to say, hey, we told you this wasn't okay. And does the conduct undermine that workplace trust and safety? So there's lots of levels of disciplinary action that might be in, look, a sort of a first warning or a counselling session is really going to be where there's a low level one-off incident. There's no sort of power imbalance. They're genuinely remorseful. You might still sort of give a warning and say, look, we understand and we appreciate that you've accepted responsibility and that, it wasn't your intention, but you need to understand you can't do that again. And we're going to give you a warning just to make that clear. But we, hope to all move forward and keep going. Now, getting into a more formal written warning, where there might be some conditions on continued employment if they don't change their behaviour. It could include doing some additional training. There are times when a demotion or change of duties may be appropriate. Like if it's a manager, a senior manager, and who has a lot of employees underneath them, I've seen instances where people are demoted, that they're taken out of that role because they have not used the power that they had in that position in the right way. If it's not quite a dismissal, but it's pretty serious and it might be a first and final warning. And termination is certainly something you can consider, but that is when that is the harassment is of a nature that is serious, deliberate, it involves coercion, threats, or repeated behaviour. They're the sort of things that will justify a summary one. So it might be with notice, but if we're getting into that space, then and it's that severe, then it could certainly be serious misconduct without notice. So it is absolutely essential to provide procedural fairness before any disciplinary action in any circumstances. So it's about a fair, unbiased and transparent process, making sure that the person who's being accused has been given the opportunity to respond to those accusations, give their side of the story a chance to respond, a chance to fix things, or a chance to demonstrate that they won't do that behaviour again. You need to treat everybody respectfully and have that confidentially throughout the process. And it's your job to gather all the facts as much as you can, and then make that decision on the balance of probabilities. So in a criminal standpoint, if you're watching Law and Order or something like that, it's, beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a criminal standard. Now, balance of probabilities is the standard that is applied in civil cases, and it is applied when it comes to issues like this or unfair dismissal, which is on the balance of probabilities with all the information in front of me. Would a reasonable person believe that this happened? Do I have enough information to believe that? And sometimes that comes about because, maybe there's been several instances and you haven't really had a lot of, evidence for each of them. But the fact that there've been several different people that have raised it can be enough. So if you fail to follow a fair and reasonable process, as part of this, and you terminate somebody, unfortunately, you might end up with an unfair dismissal claim if it's found that you didn't give them a fair process and all of those steps. And that can be even if it was found that their behaviour was inconsistent with further employment. So the tests for an unfair dismissal are unfair, unjust, or unreasonable. So they might say, well, yeah, this person did this. That's not unfair that they lost their job. It's not unreasonable, but it was unjust because you didn't go through a process of actually giving them a chance to respond, etc. So considerations that you can take as an employer: what policy or standard was breached? Was that previously communicated to this person clearly? Were they trained? How serious was it? Was it physical, verbal, visual, written? Did it cause fear, humiliation, or exclusion? Was it an isolated incident or a pattern? What would be the level of risk if we didn't take action? What impact would it have on the person that made the complaint? What impact would it have on our workplace culture? Has the person who has been accused shown accountability or have they attempted to minimize their own behavior? And will the outcome that you're sort of thinking about going along with show the rest of the team that it's taken seriously? If people are seen to get away with really poor behavior and that it's not, there's no consequences, that can really damage your culture. So I've mentioned documentation, keep records of everything, every conversation, after every conversation, send an email with a summary of it. That's how you're going to protect yourself from a risk point of view. So really, I want to finish off talking about proactive prevention because, we want to actually prevent it from happening again, right? We don't want to, we want to prevent it from happening in the first place, really. And that's actually what our obligation is under law now. So it's not optional to do prevention things. The Sexual Discrimination Act actually has a positive duty on you to do that now. So it's also really important to remember that you have a positive duty to do that with contractors, volunteers, clients, and customers. So if you have contractors that are working in your organisation, they need to understand that they need to abide by certain standards of conduct while they're there. And you can have that with any other external party that's working in your organisation. So you prevent it by trying to build a respectful workplace culture in the first place, one that, promotes psychological safety and, behaviours that are positive, and certainly that behaviour is modelled by the leadership team and others in the workplace. So it's not do as I say, not as I do. It's actually something that starts from the top. And, these are the things that build a solid culture. You need to implement clear and accessible policies. It used to be just, we've got a policy and we showed it to someone on their first day 5 years ago. That doesn't cut it anymore. You have to have a policy that really clearly states, hey, this is what isn't acceptable, and this is the complaint process, and here's the consequences if you do something like this. So they should be written in a way that people understand. They should be accessible. They should be, if you are in an industry where there's people with disabilities or low literacy, you need to make sure that you're proactively ensuring everybody understands, and they need to be regularly reviewed and updated. They're not just a set and forget. There's something you bring up. You might do some annual training on it. You might just mention it at a toolbox talk or something. You need to train people. I mean, you need, and the training doesn't have to always be formal, but if you can go, okay, we've run a session, so everybody understands exactly what is and isn't okay, how to report it. The role of bystanders is really important. So it's not just about somebody who may be, you know, doing something inappropriate or having it done against them. It's those people that are standing around letting it happen. So, everyone understands it's their job as well to step in and say something. Like if they're seeing something that's inappropriate, often things can get fixed at the coalface. And certainly leaders and managers need to know what is and isn't okay, how to respond to a concern that's raised, how to make sure that they are role modeling the right behaviours, and what the positive duty is, because so many issues sometimes get into a snag because the business owner might understand, or the HR manager understands, or some leaders understand, but then you've got that one who just doesn't care and dismisses it, and that causes a whole ripple effect of risk that you don't need. So you want to make sure that your actual work systems are designed in a way that is safe and inclusive. So, all aspects of how work, how do you roster? What are the reporting lines? Do people understand about how things should work at workplace events? Is there anything in your physical layout, that might contribute to risk? You need to do a risk assessment to see, are there hot spots? Are there little areas of your business where, no one can be seen? Does someone work in a client-facing role, which automatically increases the risk? Do they understand, if they're in that client-facing role, what the expectations are on them as an employee, what they should do if they feel uncomfortable, or what they can and can't say? Like, there's a whole heap of things that you need to ensure are in place. And look, sometimes anonymous reporting can be an option. Sometimes having that ability for someone to just, make an anonymous report without having to sort of say too much, at least, even if you can't do anything with that information at that time, it might show a pattern of behavior. If you're getting some anonymous, reports from different places about somebody, that should be a red flag. Just ensure you take everything seriously, respond to it, even if you think it's a bit of a nothing issue. Don't wait for the formal complaint to come in, just get in and start looking at it. And, make sure people feel like it is safe to report. And, even if they don't get the outcome they want, if they felt safe and supported throughout the process, and then people are more likely to, feel safe to come forward again if they need to. Monitor and review regularly. So, like, are there any trends happening? Consult with people, do surveys, exit interviews. Often exit interviews are sometimes where this information starts to come to light and your pattern starts to emerge. And address where there are any power imbalances. So, you can see where risks are. So if you have, one young, I don't want to just say it happens to women, but like one young female employee in a male-dominated industry with all these guys that are at least 10, 15 years older than her. And I was in that situation in a large construction company, and I was pretty good at holding my own, but not everybody is. Or are they working with contractors or clients that have a known reputation for, being inappropriate? So you need to make sure that you're monitoring that situation and making sure that, there's no coercion going on. So, is there someone who controls the rostering or controls an aspect of that person's employment, and they could use that to try and get it something for their advantage. Again, I'd like to think that this doesn't happen, but unfortunately I know it does. So just a few frequently asked questions to finish up. What if the employee says it was just a joke? Well, it doesn't matter if it was just a joke, because it's not how it was intended, it was how it was taken. And if it's something that a reasonable person would have expected, would intend to humiliate or intimidate, it's impact more than intent. So good intentions do not mean no impact. It was just a joke, it's not an excuse, and we're all responsible for how our actions land. Human beings have all probably said something that just didn't land or was really inappropriate in the moment and just went, oh, I can't believe I said that. But, if you do that once and you never do it again, that's very different to someone who thinks that that's an ongoing pattern of behaviour. You have to investigate if someone doesn't want to take it further? You kind of do, if it's depending on the issue. So you do have a legal obligation to at least assess the risk. and manage that risk. Now, obviously, we want to take in people's, you know, what their preferences are as much as possible, but you do have not just a positive duty to provide a safe working environment, but a positive duty under the Act to, you know, take reasonable proactive steps and proportionate action to ensure that that's safe. So if you've got someone that sort of raised something with you and they don't want to take it any further, you know, I've been in situations several times over my career and I've had to say to someone, now that I know this, I can't unknow it, and I'm going to try and minimize this for you as much as possible, but I try and explain to them why I have to do something about it and why I can't just let that go, because, you know, again, it's very different to an inappropriate joke that was said once versus someone that has done something that is incredibly you know, not okay. So it's very nuanced, but the short answer is, like, you can't just, unless it's something really low level and, you know, everyone can move on quickly, then you may need to do something about it. What if it happens outside work hours or offsite? Too bad, so sad. If it's a work function, if they're traveling for work, if it's in a shared online space such as Slack or Teams, or it's outside hours and there is a connection to work. So if you're two staff and you're socializing together or you're out socializing with clients and something happens, that is considered workplace. So, you know, it is important to remember that there are several cases that highlight this, that, you know, you still have risk. So you need to make sure that your employees are aware of that and you're aware of it. Can't I just separate them and hope it goes away? Please don't. Because that could just be seen as, you know, and sometimes that is what people do. Oh, well, we'll just move them into different jobs. Like, first of all, if you're moving someone and actually making a change, often what happens is the actual person who made the complaint has the consequences to them, which is just mind-blowing, because, you know, if they're the one that's had it happen to them, they shouldn't be the one who's having some sort of impact on their job or career. So you do not want to penalize the person making the complaint. You know, so you've got to support it with some accountability and really work out what's happening. But, you know, you have to act. What if they're a high performer or a long-term team member? Law applies to everybody equally. And it doesn't matter how long you've been there, how great an employee you are, how great a mate you are, how great a performer you are. If you choose to protect a star employee who is performing, who is behaving badly, you will end up with legal consequences at some point, and it's happened many times. I mean, there's some great ones. You know, let's talk about the Harvey Weinstein of the world that everyone knew about and just excused until people actually stood up. So, you actually, as a leader or as a business owner, can have liability here, and so you need to be really careful. Can I deal with it informally to avoid damaging someone's reputation? Well, you avoid that by keeping it confidential, making sure everybody's on the same page, and just going through a fair and reasonable process and only involving those you need to. Can I be sued if I get it wrong? Your legal risk of not dealing with it at all is a lot higher than getting it wrong. Like, if you do a fair and reasonable process and follow your own procedures, get someone to help if you're really not comfortable with it, and show that you've done all the things to try and do the right thing, then, you know, you're pretty well protected. But if you, through fear of, don't, then that's a very different outcome. What if it turns out to be false? Now, it is very rare for someone to make a false allegation. It's often not false. It's often just ends up being unsubstantiated. So there wasn't enough evidence. It just means it couldn't be proven. So there's a lot of reasons why it's very rare that people do make false allegations, mainly that it's actually comes with a lot of personal risk to career, to reputation, to other things, to come forward, and also your own mental and physical health. A lot of people make a report not to punish someone, but just to make it stop. I just want that person to leave me alone. I just want this person to stop the behaviour. False complaints actually require intent and fabrication, and that's really rare. And if you're going through an investigation process, then, you know, if you can't substantiate things, then, you know, it'd be very difficult for it to go further. And there are a lot, it's perpetuated in the media. Like, there are so many myths about, you know, skewed perception. You know, I heard a great analogy when someone said, you know, if someone rings the police and says, oh, someone broke into my car, they don't go, well, can you prove someone broke in your car before we come out? They come out and look at it. Whereas if someone rings and says, I've been sexually assaulted, you know, there's been times where people have been told, oh, well, you know, do you have any proof that you've been sexually assaulted? Like, they're both a crime. You know, you assume that something has happened if someone makes a complaint until you have a reason not to. And look, it is very, very rare. Look, that's not saying it never happens, but it is, you know, anyone who's in any cases that hit the headlines, like, it takes a lot of bravery for people to step forward. So as an employer, the benefits to you: reducing your legal and financial risk. You know, there's plenty of legal costs and things that can become involved if it's not handled well. It certainly improves your morale and culture. You know, it's having good policies, having, you know, a understanding of employees that they can make complaints is really important. Certainly recruitment and retention can be improved because you get lowest turnover and higher engagement if people are happy and not getting harassed at work. They're much more likely to stay with someone who actually took real action in this area. You know, it gives people a sense of security. And a lot of young people, particularly coming into the workforce, are looking for organisations that are really proactive in this space. It can definitely increase productivity. You know, it's been shown through some research that, you know, Australian businesses cost up to $6 billion annually through absenteeism and lost productivity and claims for people dealing with these issues. So, you know, if you have a workplace where everyone's respectful, then it's certainly, you know, going to have a lot less conflict, improved innovation, improved productivity. And finally, just because it's the right thing to do, like, it's the right thing to do to actually support someone. It's the right thing to do to make sure that what someone, you know, that you have a safe workplace for everybody. So my final thoughts before I finish up is that, you know, I've got a couple of quotes here. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I do like both of those quotes. Before we get on to questions, which I'm very happy to do, our next upcoming webinars, can you tell I was finishing this just before I came in here and didn't fix my heading? June is all about award increases. We do the same one every year. It's usually our most popular one every year. There's some interesting things going on this year, so watch that space. July, I saw at least one person who registered had onboarding employees on their list of topics, so fantastic. We've got that coming up in July. But what we are going to be sending out to you all with the recording of this is a survey about our HR services and what training we're going to be doing and what webinars we can doing. And we'd love you to fill that in for us. And we are giving away a spot on our next Lead with Impact training for one lucky person that actually completes that survey. So we encourage you to do that. Speaking of training, we have leadership training in Brisbane at the end of next week. You still have a couple of days left to book for that. We are just finishing up our first 5-month online training program, Lead with Impact, and that's been fantastic. We've really enjoyed it. We've had over 20 people doing that. And so we have announced our next one. Has been launched for July. Early bird is on until the 30th of June. If you'd like more information on that, visit our upcoming training on our website or let me know. We also have some mental health first aid coming up, both refresher courses and blended online. Again, all of our training and webinars are all found on our upcoming training page section of our website. I just wanted to quickly mention that, you know, we do have our HR coaching calls now. So if you're not one of our support clients that is actually on a package, we have HR coaching calls. So if you had, say, for example, an issue around sexual harassment or something you needed some help with, you can literally book one of our HR coaching calls. It's a set price. You know what it's going to cost you. We spend an hour with you. We send you a whole heap of information to follow up with some suggestions and recommendations and talking points and lots of things to help you with that. And we always do for our support clients some policy training, but I recently was up in Sydney doing some workplace conduct and culture training with this 2-hour workshop, and it was really interactive. It's very much about like a workshop environment, not just, going through all the laws, but actually making it so it's, people are a little bit engaged with the process, and it's about, all types of workplace behaviours of bullying and harassment and discrimination, and talking about it and understanding it. And it certainly is something that would help in terms of being proactive. So that's our standard pricing. We do have discounts for existing clients as well. And certainly the 2-hour program, I would prefer to do it in person because it is, but we can do it online because we can still do breakouts and things, online as well. So I encourage you to follow us if you want to watch any of our previous webinars, jump on our YouTube, but I can see that we've got a couple of questions. So I'm going to pull those up now. The first one there is focusing on sexual harassment between employees. How does it differ in dealing with allegations of sexual harassment from an ongoing patient? Well, I guess how it differs is in the first instance is between two employees. They both work for you, so you can actually have consequences for the person in terms of a disciplinary process. If it's somebody who is an external person, external stakeholder, and say it's an ongoing patient, then you have to remember that you have to provide a safe working environment for your employees. So, we have had these questions. We work with a lot of allied health. So I would usually start with, do you have some sort of code of conduct that you ask patients to agree to when they start working with you? Have you spoken to this person about their behaviour and why it's inappropriate? And, potentially, there's a few things it's one of those ones that I'd probably like to get into a detailed conversation with you. But you need to consider things like, the employee themselves, their comfort level with dealing with that person, versus, the fact that you also need to remember that they might not want to rock the boat or make things difficult. So if they've raised it with you and they've got to that point, then there probably is a problem for them. You now know it's an issue. So if you allow that person to continue to come in and see that practitioner, that could continue to be a problem and actually be a psychological safety risk for your business. So I'd want to be either moving them to a different practitioner, or potentially, depending on the nature of what happens, moving them, saying to them, look, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to continue with your support. But again, I'd need more nuance to give something more specific. And the next question is commenting on someone's appearance, body weight in a complimentary manner when they don't welcome it in a non-sexual nature considered harassment. Yeah, because particularly in a workplace, because everybody has the, I guess, the right to be comfortable at work and not be made to feel uncomfortable at work, and what one person sees as a complimentary manner, another person can see as icky and, making me feel really uncomfortable. So, because that's a little bit like it's just a joke. Oh, but I was just complimenting you. Well, I've told you it makes me feel uncomfortable, so can you please stop? And if they don't stop after that, then they're making a choice to do something they know makes that person uncomfortable. So therefore, they're a grown adult, and if they can't make that choice, then there's consequences when we can't make choices. Certainly, I think, it depends on the situation, but we had, not that long ago, maybe a year or two ago, a situation where there was a young receptionist at one of our clients who was, she was a very attractive young lady. There was 3 particular patients there were issues with. 2 had just kind of, hitting on her and asking her out. And they were doing it, they weren't being over the top and, but they were making her feel uncomfortable. The 3rd actually ended up having to go to the police because it was almost stalking. But unfortunately, the managers or the business owner's first response, he said, well, I just told her she should say she has a boyfriend. And I'm like, no, she shouldn't have to say she has a boyfriend. And this is where you need to empower your team and actually tell them where they can, what the boundaries are and what is acceptable for them to do. Now, in that situation, I said, I would say to her, if someone, is sort of hitting on you and you say, this is actually my workplace, and I'd really appreciate if you didn't sort of flirt with me or hit on me because it's really inappropriate. Now, there's nothing, you can say that nicely and respectfully, but if that person continues, then you want to be doing something about that. You want to be stepping in. So, the appropriate response is, and not, and it's saying, look, I understand that you think that what you're doing is a nice thing. That's not, but it's making someone feel uncomfortable. And I'm sure you don't want to make someone feel uncomfortable. So I'm asking you to stop that behavior. And I'm letting you know if you continue that behavior, then there will be consequences to that. Like we may have to not allow you to come in and see someone anymore. So there's only a couple of people left on the call. So if anyone does want to has any other questions or wants to, unmute and actually, or raise their hand and ask any other questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. But thank you everybody for coming along. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate the questions. If you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out. More than happy to give some more information to you. If it's a particular issue you really need some specific advice about, then maybe book a HR coaching call, and our team are more than happy to help you with that. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you for your attention, and yeah, we wish you all the best, and we will hopefully see you at our June webinar. Thank you.